domino theory, of course, was this idea of a domino train. If one country fell to communism, then the country next door would be next. And people in America believed this because that appeared to be what was happening. Countries all across Eastern Europe fell to communism and they were all next to each other. And the same was happening over in Asia, where China, which is next, shares a border with the USSR, the Soviet Union that is, fell to communism, and then North Korea did, and then here looked like Vietnam was going to. So people genuinely believed that if they didn't make a stand somewhere, communism was just going to keep spreading. And Eisenhower, the president in the 1950s, he believed in it. During the 1950s in America, there was something called the Red Scare. Red is the colour which symbolised communism. And people in America were scared of communism within the United States. There'd been a politician called McCarthy who sort of tried to hunt out communist American government. He'd been exposed as a bit of a fraud, but there was certainly 100% Soviet spies that had infiltrated American government. And we know this, well, we certainly know this because people have, after the fact, said that they were communist spies, and people were caught for it as well. But apart from that, the Soviet Union, a communist country who were against America in the Cold War, and America's biggest enemy, well, they'd had spies in America working on the nuclear bomb, and they passed all the secrets of the nuclear bomb to the Soviet Union, so that the Soviet Union had their own nuclear bomb by 1949, just 4 years after the Americans had, well, an American team had created it. So there was a reason for this Red Scare, but it meant that people in America thought that communism was something to be feared, and therefore a stand had to be taken against it. And also, maybe more importantly, the politicians had to be shown to be standing up to communism, because during the Red Scare, if you were accused of being a communist spy, whether it was true or not, that could be your career over. So politicians went out of their way to prove that they were acting hard on communism, which meant, well, Vietnam was a convenient way of proving that you were hard on communism by invading, or by supporting the efforts in Vietnam. So the Red Scare was quite important. America being a democracy is very important in understanding this war. It will crop up again in other questions. In a democracy, the leader of the country, or the leaders of the country, are voted in by the people. So if they want to stay in power, they have to listen to what people think, and that's called popular opinion. And in America, we've already talked about the Red Scare. People also believed in the domino theory. People wanted communism to be stopped in America. And because it's a democracy, the leadership had to pay attention to that if they wanted to be voted into power. American presidents, or presidential candidates, in elections after the Second World War, were always talking about being tough on communism. They were going to be the tough guys that were going to stop this evil from spreading. So that's quite important, because how can you prove that you are paying attention to popular opinion? Well, in this case, getting involved in Vietnam. It was the popular thing to do. People wanted it to happen, as proven by polls, which you'll have learnt about from your Quizlets. Agent Orange was one of the things that the Americans spread all over the jungle to destroy the jungle, which in itself was terrible, but it also, if any woman happened to breathe it in, it caused terrible birth defects in their children that they had. And it's shocking. I mean, that still's happening now. You can see it on the internet. So that made the American tactics very inhumane. And napalm, which was jelly which stuck to you and burnt and couldn't be put out, or certainly couldn't be put out very easily, well, that was also destroying the jungle and all the wildlife, but it was damaging children. There's a really famous photograph of a child who's had all her clothes burnt off from a napalm strike. It was indiscriminate killing, causing massive damage to the environment, and it was just incredibly unpopular when the effects of these things came out in the media. Of course, the main way that Americans tried to combat guerrilla warfare was through search and destroy, which is effectively deadly hide and seek. They wanted to search out and find the Viet Cong and destroy them. But the success of search and destroy missions were judged on body count. So if you came back and said you've got 50 of them, that was kind of taken as, okay, there we go, there's plenty of you on there that can witness that, fair enough. But it wasn't like, it was difficult to tell who was innocent and who was Viet Cong because they weren't wearing a uniform. And so the fact that there was pressure on the soldiers to have success, and success was judged on body counts, meant that innocents were often killed. For example, in the My Lai massacre, where many completely innocent Vietnamese villages were massacred, and worse, by American troops, well, that was a search and destroy mission, and so for obvious reasons that came under massive criticism. Of course, you could argue that the main reason that the tactics were criticised is because they weren't working. Pretty much the American tactics all killed loads of Viet Cong. Don't get me wrong, they killed so many Viet Cong. But for the Viet Cong that they killed, they probably created far more enemies. So it was like a napalm strike, uncovered the jungle, probably killed some Viet Cong in the strikes themselves, made it easier for the American soldiers to find and kill Viet Cong because the cover of the jungle had been taken away. But think of how many Vietnamese people would be furious at what happened and therefore more likely to support the Viet Cong or even join them. And there's many examples of what the Americans were doing. Yes, were killing many of their enemies, but were creating so many supporters for their enemies. It was a flawed policy, they were flawed tactics, they just were not working. And apart from that, of course, many of these tactics were creating anti-war feeling back in the United States, which undermined the war effort. When Nixon was running to be elected as president, his election slogan was "Peace with Honour." That's how important Vietnam had become to the American public, that it wasn't about getting people jobs or whatever it is in America. His slogan was specific to Vietnam, peace with honour. And then he invaded Laos and Cambodia. So people had voted for him thinking he was going to get them peace with honour, and he invaded 2 other countries beside Vietnam in an attempt to try to stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But that massively increased criticism against Nixon for obvious reasons, because it appeared to many that he'd gone back on his word, or that he tricked them into electing him. One of Nixon's big ideas, one of his main policies, was Vietnamization, which was to train up the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, basically the Southern Army, to take over more of the fight, and so that Americans can do less and less and gradually withdraw until they can completely leave and the South can stand on their own 2 feet. Of course, it clearly didn't work, because almost as soon as the Americans had left, or not very long after they'd left, the North invaded the South and won really quite easily, relatively easily anyway. So Vietnamization, therefore, was not a success. And I should point out that it was quite easy to see from observers that whenever the ARVN came up against the Viet Cong, they were often beaten. More often than not, they were beaten. Whenever the Viet Cong came against the Americans often won that battle. So, rock, paper, scissors, that sort of thing. If the Viet Cong were going to come up against the ARVN, which they were when the Americans left, they were going to lose. You could see that before the Americans actually left, that Vietnamization wasn't working. Nixon's policy for the peace talks that were ongoing in Paris was to join them and try to make the North Vietnamese and anybody else there think that he was willing to use nuclear bombs on Vietnam because he hated communism so much. This was the madman theory, and it clearly didn't work, because he came to the peace talks with this in mind, with this sort of idea. This is 1969 when he first attends these peace talks. Well, the peace talks didn't end until the Americans left in the early 1970s. They went on for years. So the madman theory clearly didn't scare them. It didn't trick them. It didn't fool the North Vietnamese into suing for peace. They just let the talks drag on and on. Well, of course, up until 1968, the media was largely positive about the Vietnam War, and public opinion was in favour of the Vietnam War, and people were under the impression that they were winning. And then the Tet Offensive happened. This is when the Viet Cong came out of hiding and decided to attack major cities, major areas of population during the Tet New Year festival in Vietnam, which in previous years nobody had really fought on. It was like an unspoken truce. Well, they used that as an opportunity to catch their enemy whilst they're off guard, and some Viet Cong even got into the American embassy. Anyway, this was shown on the news and people were shocked. They thought, well, this doesn't look like we're winning. And so it started to sow that seed of doubt in the American public that, well, we've been fighting all this time at great expense and many lives lost and people terribly injured, and yet this is still happening. So it seemed to dispel this illusion that Americans had that they were winning, or that the American public had that they were winning, and started to turn people against the war. And then, of course, there was My Lai, where Charlie Company went and massacred mostly women and children and old men in the village of My Lai on a search and destroy mission. We've already talked about it. Well, that happened in 1968, but it didn't actually start to come out into the media till 1969. And so if Tet Offensive dispelled the myth among the American public that they were winning the war, My Lai dispelled the myth that the Americans were the good guys who were saving the Vietnamese, because, well, the rape and murders that happened in My Lai clearly showed the Americans as not the good guys in this war. And when that came out in the media, it really started to turn public opinion against the war. It has to be noted that the media in both of these cases were absolutely crucial, you could say fundamental, great word, in turning public opinion against the war in Vietnam. People listen to what they hear in the media, as you and I do now. And if we're looking at growing opposition to the US involvement, well, you pick something maybe from the end of the timeline and talk maybe about Nixon. We've already spoken about this. And here, Nixon promised peace with honour, then invaded Laos and Cambodia, so people felt that he'd gone back on his word. So that grew yet more opposition, because some people might have sort of taken a bit of a back seat from being against the war, thinking that Nixon was going to get peace with honour sooner rather than later, and then he escalates the war with invading Laos and Cambodia, which therefore would grow more people's opposition to the war in Vietnam. Well, we've already spoken about the domino theory. People believed that they had to take a stand somewhere or the dominoes would keep falling, or in other words, countries would keep falling to communism until it spread and further around the world. So there was support for the US involvement because they really believed this theory, that they had to stop communism somewhere, and what better place than Vietnam. There was also support for US involvement because in 1949 China had turned communist. There'd been a big civil war in China and it turned communist. And there was a feeling in America that the USA had lost China to communism. Of course, it's ridiculous because China was never owned by the United States. But this sort of feeling and this criticism of the politicians at the time meant that politicians afterwards felt under pressure not to lose other countries to communism, and this included Vietnam. So there was a feeling that amongst the politicians that they had to take a stand in Vietnam or face even more criticism for losing Vietnam to communism. And America had some vested interest in Vietnam because they'd spent so much money giving money and weapons to the French for them to fight against the Viet Cong. So if they'd spent all that money trying to stop communism spreading in Vietnam and then just left it to fall when the French left, well, that would have been unpopular in America. Well, it's a waste of money, and again they could criticise the American politicians for losing Vietnam to communism. And there was support for the war because there was genuine fear of communism. We've already talked about the Red Scare. People thought there were communists all infiltrating American public life, politicians and so on and so forth. And there's a reason for that fear. It wasn't just craziness. There had been Soviet spies, communist spies operating in America, and some had been caught and some had fled to the USSR and been exposed many years later and so on and so forth. And a fact of why this was important, well, Americans had developed the nuclear bomb, which they used in 1945 for the first time, and the Soviet Union had got the bombs in 1949 themselves, so America were the only ones with a nuclear bomb, only for 4 years, and their main rival in the world had it 4 years later. Well, the reason they had the nuclear bomb quite soon after America is because spies on the team developing the nuclear bomb in America had passed the secrets over to the Soviet Union. So there was a reason for this fear in America, and that's just one example, one very famous example. But this meant that, of course, the war in Vietnam was going to be popular, as proven by the polls, which you'll learn the facts of from your Quizlet, because people were scared of communism, and this was a chance to try to stop it from spreading even further. Well, you've got to state that Viet Cong guerrilla warfare was really successful tactics to use. The punji traps, low cost, high impact, the use of the jungle as cover, the tunnels, which the traps, the mines, the booby traps, all of this took a terrible psychological toll on the Americans, and led to the Americans using tactics which were not really suited to this type of warfare, and which we'll talk about for the next paragraph. But yeah, you can chuck in some of those examples I've just used. As good as the Viet Cong tactics were, the US tactics were not very good. They had to try to root out the communists, and they used various different methods which actually created more enemies than they killed. They killed vast numbers of enemies, but they created vast numbers of enemies in doing so. So we've talked about Napalm and Agent Orange. That you may have seen clips from Platoon or other Vietnam War films where US soldiers use Zippo raids, burning down villages to try to find Viet Cong, and killing, arresting, harassing innocent along with those who were genuine enemies. And so it was kind of, in many ways, a war that was impossible to win by force, because the force that they were having to use was just creating more enemies. What I would use in my exam, a phrase I would use, is the American tactics were deeply flawed. And we'll go back to this again. This is the thing with these exam booklets, they'll indicate to you what the key bits of knowledge are. Well, there was a lack of support by the end of the war back in America, especially after 1968 and 9 with My Lai and the Tet Offensive coming out in the media. But the lack of support in America. America is a democracy. If public opinion wants something not to happen, the leaders of America have to not do it, or they will find themselves not being re-elected in the next elections, because America is a democracy. So the lack of support for the war later in the 60s and into the early 70s is a very big reason why America lost the war in Vietnam. Just as a lot of support for making a stand against communism was a reason why America got involved. Public opinion sways what the leaders have to do in a democracy.